Hi, everybody. Welcome to our third session of the day, Women's Politics Today. We're going to hear three excellent papers from three outstanding professionals who will be presenting to us. We have Rachel Berhnard, who is an assistant professor of political science from UC Davis. We have Jane Symeka. Did I pronounce that right?
Semeka. That's okay.
Okay. Professor of history from Brookdale Community College. And then we have Ellen Rafshoon, who's an associate professor of history from Georgia Gwinnett College. So I'm going to hand it over to Rachel.
Great. Thank you so much, Bianca. I'm really delighted to be here. I was just telling the other panelists, it's been super interesting. I'm teaching a Women in Politics course this term, and I feel like I'm coming away with all sorts of great new things to tell my students about. So thank you for the opportunity to be here and to learn from everybody else. So I'm a political scientist. My presentation will have a slightly different feel than some of the history presentations that we've seen so far. What I wanted to share with you all today is some work in progress with a former undergrad student of mine, Alan Yan, now a graduate student at UC Berkeley, that we're really excited to share, in part because we think it's really relevant to what's going on in the US today. So the research question that we started with was whether women and men have equal opportunities to speak up and participate in politics. And as you might imagine, we have lots of reasons to think that it might not be an entirely egalitarian experience. So by way of sort of scholarly background, we know that women are often subject to silencing and even violence when they participate in politics, including online. But a lot of this research that studies this tends to focus on elites. So it focuses on women candidates running for office. It focuses on people in the media, for instance, high-level politicians and their families. And we don't actually know a lot about what goes on at lower levels of political participation. So in particular, we thought there are so many women who are volunteering. We know that in many countries, women volunteer at higher rates than men do. They vote at higher rates than men do. But in the context of the US, we know that they're much less likely to run for office and less likely to achieve office when they are running, in part due to discrimination against women, not so much directly, but because their qualifications are often overlooked or discounted. So we thought there's sort of an interesting tension here. Like, women seem to participate a lot at the beginning of the pipeline. They don't end up at the end of the pipeline being as successful or deciding to run. And we wanted to know what's happening in between the two. So what is that experience of participating like? And we hope that eventually this project will build into something that can tell us about women's ambitions more broadly and how they're affected by these experiences. So we start out by acknowledging that there's a challenge to doing this sort of work in political science, which is that trying to study something on the ground in real elections is costly. It's time intensive. It requires partnering with organizations. But we do think from some of the work that has been done that men and women are likely to have different experiences when they participate. So our goal here is to really build a new literature in this area that enables us to say whether women and men's experiences are different, not based on other types of differences that might be correctable, for instance. So you could imagine there are these big literatures saying that women talk about politics in a different way. For instance, they use different rhetorical strategies. And all those can be manipulated by candidates, right? But we can't manipulate things like our gender in real life. And so it's often hard to say exactly what's doing the work if women and men are having different experiences. Are they engaging differently? Are they presenting themselves differently? Or is it something about how they're being treated? So our approach to doing this was to partner with a national progressive organization that was doing Get Out the Vote campaigning via text message. And what that allows us to do is actually study the experience of volunteering in real life, you know, in a way that exactly mirrors the experiences regular political volunteers would have. But doing it via text message allows us to manipulate voters' beliefs about who is texting them. And in particular, what we do is randomize the names that volunteers use. So what we start is by asking whether they receive more offensive messages from volunteers, whether the volunteers receive more offensive messages from respondents. And we do this just with a simple binary measure. So take a look at this text. Does it seem offensive or not really offensive? And that's rated by other volunteers, not the ones who are participating in the study. We also wanted to know the characteristics of the messages, whether they're discouraging or encouraging. So we could imagine, for instance, that some messages might not rise to the level of offensive or rudeness, but they might be sort of more subtly discouraging, or differentially, there might be more encouragement given to certain kinds of volunteers. So right now we only have this measure for our second study. You might have seen on the previous slide that we ran 2 studies in spring 2018. And again, these are rated by different volunteers, and the scale spans from very encouraging, somewhat encouraging, neither encouraging, discouraging, somewhat discouraging, very discouraging. And again, that's rated by different volunteers. And then the final measure we look at is silencing. So this is cutting off the conversation with the volunteer asking not to be contacted again, or saying that they want the conversation to end. And in both studies, we measure this using software that these organizations already use to track opt-out requests. So if the voter who's being contacted expresses at any time they don't want to be contacted again, that shows up as our measure of silencing in our study. So how do we manipulate voters' perceptions of who's who? As I mentioned, we randomize the names. So they're randomized to receive a text message from the same volunteer. It's potentially the same person who gets assigned to all of these different names as they're texting different voters. And we use a stereotypically male name, Michael, to represent the male condition, a stereotypically female name, Jessica, to represent that condition. We also tried out using an ambiguous name, Taylor, that we thought could be potentially assumed to be either a woman or a man. And that's what we refer to as a placebo. So when we make the comparisons that you'll see in the next few slides, we're actually comparing how messages that quote unquote Jessica sends do compare to the messages that Taylor sends, rather than those that are sent to Michael. And our hope is by having those 3 different name conditions that we can get some sense for how much this is about voters' beliefs about the gender of the person that they're working with, that they're texting with, rather than just comparing Michael and Jessica, and then we don't really know if the action is sort of discrimination against women or in favor of men. By having something that is more ambiguous to compare to, that gives us a different sort of level against which to compare. And then finally, we also have a 4th condition, which is not using a name at all. And we use that because we might think in sending out these sort of text messages, sometimes voters might think that those are automated messages, that there's not really a real human being there. And we thought the no name condition would be most likely to emulate that. So this is kind of what it looks like on somebody's phone. They're getting a text message, and the text message using the campaign software brings in the voter's name. So it would say something like, "Hi, Rachel, I'm," and then the software randomizes to choose Michael or Jessica or Taylor or no name at all. "I'm Jessica, a volunteer with Next Gen America. This Saturday, March 24th, young people have organized a march to spread awareness and demand gun safety legislation from our elected officials. Find a local march for our lives here." All of you probably remember this going on in spring 2018. So what we've done in partnering with this organization is just have the ability to evaluate whether, if the same person, say me, Rachel, is assigned to use a name like Michael, how do I get treated by voters when I'm texting versus when I use a name like Jessica, and so on. So who exactly are we texting as part of this study? So the individuals that we're contacting here are people who had previously opted into receiving messages from this organization. So that's important because we didn't want to just spam people out of the blue. We probably could have gotten research permission to do it, but we felt more comfortable partnering with an organization, knowing that in theory, people have already opted in. And the organization was texting people who their internal data suggested would be interested in attending a political rally. So in the first study, we contacted about 60,000 people, and in the second study, about 75,000 people. And some of the things to keep in the back of your head as you're taking a look at the results is that first, because this organization is a progressive organization, the individuals they're contacting are also likely to be progressive. So we don't have any data on whether they're Democrats or independents or Green Party or anything like that, but there are probably relatively few conservatives registered or having opted in to work with this organization. And then second, because these individuals opted in, we would expect that any effects we find to be lower bounds on these behaviors. So what do I mean by that? What we mean here is that if I contact you out of the blue, you're probably much more likely to tell me to, go screw myself, right? Than if it's an organization that you've opted into in the past. You might just say, no, thanks, if you're hearing from somebody who you've given permission to contact you compared to when you haven't given permission. So we expect that any sort of bad treatment or hostility is likely to have a lower base rate in our study than what we would expect if we had just contacted a random sample of people who had not given us permission to contact them. So when you see these estimates, you might think to yourself, gosh, they seem like kind of small effects. Well, part of that is because it's people contacting sort of ideologically friendly people for the most part. So let me give you an example of what these messages look like. And I apologize for the strong language here, but this is the sort of message that we get. So here are examples of messages that are counted as offensive: no, you're fat, piss off, that sort of thing. And messages that could count as encouraging or discouraging: thanks for your work, Jessica, or that seems like a fruitless effort. And then silencing, we get lots of these messages, things like stop texting, leave me alone, etc. And text can be coded as any combination of these three categories. So what does this look like in terms of the number of offensive messages that volunteers get when they're randomized to use these different names? Well, what we see is that in all cases, those volunteers who are assigned to use a female name when they contact voters receive more offensive messages. So that's the purple bar that you're reading there. And remember here, our 0, our baseline, is compared to the ambiguous name, Taylor. So we see that volunteers who are nominally women for the purposes of our study receive more offensive messages. People who are assigned to use the name Michael receive fewer offensive messages than those who are using the volunteer name Taylor to contact people. And then finally, there's a pretty high rate of offensive messages that are received when the volunteer is assigned to use no name at all. And we can see that the patterns are pretty consistent across men and women respondents. And if anything, women respondents are maybe a little bit more likely to send an offensive message to those volunteers who are assigned to use the name Jessica than men are, though the difference isn't great. In contrast, you can see men are much less likely to send offensive messages to somebody they think is another man compared to how women treat other women. And we see, again, a really similar pattern with discouraging messages. So those volunteers who are using the name Jessica receive these really discouraging messages on average. In contrast, Michael actually gets a net positive, encouraging message. So this is a really different experience that our volunteers are having depending on which name they're assigned to use that day. And then our final measure here of silencing, so being told, I don't want to talk anymore, please don't contact me again, we again see the same pattern. So volunteers assigned to use the stereotypically female name have their conversations cut off at much higher rates than people with ambiguous names do, and certainly than those with stereotypically male names do. And we actually, interestingly, see here that there is not much of a difference for the no-name condition. And again, we think that that might be because voters are assuming that this is a robo message or something like that, and that there's no point in kind of responding or having a conversation further. So just to sum up what we found here, we find that female names are significantly more likely to receive offensive messages, including from other women, and they're more likely to receive discouraging messages. And in fact, men who are texting are significantly more likely to receive encouraging messages on average. So there's a really big difference there. Finally, those volunteers using female names are more likely to be silenced, and the no-name texts are less likely to be silenced on average. So what are we doing going forward? Well, first, as I mentioned, our measure of discouragement or encouragement is only for study 2. So we're trying to get that coded for study 1 now. And we think that this raises a lot of interesting questions that we want to explore further. So for instance, we were really surprised by the high rate of offensive and discouraging messages that women send to someone they think is another woman. What's going on there? Is that internalized sexism? Or conversely, could it be something like women are afraid to offend men that they think are texting them, but they feel comfortable doing so with women? So there might be really different motivations going on there. And we also wonder, too, what the effects would be like with a conservative organization. So here we've studied a liberal or progressive organization, but we don't really have a good sense yet whether it would look the same way had we been partnered with a different sort of organization. And as we alluded to earlier, when we don't have previous opt-in, we might expect something really different. Finally, one of the things we're interested in is whether this operates differently in different forums or media of contact. So we might imagine, for instance, exactly the opposite could be true with somebody coming to knock on your door. You might feel much more comfortable with a woman knocking on your door than a man. So that's a possibility, and we're hoping to explore all of this in follow-up research, and that is our presentation for the day. Thank you.
Hello, I am Jane Semeka, and I am going to have a PowerPoint here. And so my paper is called The Price of Liberty is Maternal Vigilance, Understanding Women's Political Engagement After the 2016 Election. And I am a professor of history at Brookdale Community College in Lincroft, New Jersey. And so the paper, The Price of Liberty is Maternal Vigilance, focuses on a couple of goals. First of all, to understand the rise of women's political engagement since the 2016 election, and to put it in historical context. The conclusion of the chapter is also that in addition to explaining the history behind women's political engagement, to make some predictions about this revitalized women's movement that is more inclusive, and also some predictions about perhaps the passage of the Equal Rights Amendment. So after the defeat of Hillary Clinton in 2016, many women were really devastated. And what we found pretty quickly after the election was over was that the defeat of Hillary Clinton was not an end, but it was a beginning. Rebecca Traister writes in her book, nearly every woman I spoke to, especially in the months immediately following the inauguration of Donald Trump, described her anger as a thing of the past. Quote, I was angry, but I'm not angry anymore. I've taken my anger and I've turned it into action. And so as women were digesting what had happened in the defeat of Hillary Clinton, they decided that they were not going to retreat, but that they were going to fight, that they were going to enter politics rather than withdraw from politics. And so I was really interested in trying to understand in historical terms why this took place. And so I began to think about some of the things that I teach about in my women's history class, particularly the idea of the Republican mother and the idea of true womanhood. And so the twin ideas of Republican motherhood and true womanhood provide a way to understand the current rise of women's activism and continue to inspire women today to get involved politically. In the American Revolution, women were deeply involved. Women were involved as boycotters, fundraisers. Women even were spies during the revolution. They followed the troops and provided essential services to the armies. And their diaries and their letters show us that women not only were patriotic in supporting the war, but truly understood the principles of the revolution, the ideas of liberty and equality and natural rights. Historians Linda Kerber and Carol Berkin have written extensively on the idea of Republican motherhood, that even though the war was over, women were going to, after the war, play a very important role in this new republic. Remember, the United States was the first republic in the modern era, and that they had just fought to become independent of a monarchy. And so even though women were not full citizens in the United States, they did have an important obligation. They were going to play a role as the mothers of the republic and had the responsibility of teaching the virtues of republicanism to this new generation. That Linda Kerber reminds us that women had to successfully integrate domesticity and politics and to reinforce the ideas of the common good in this new generation. And so living in a republic was very different than living in a monarchy. Remember, the king that they had just fought against was corrupt and a tyrant. And so the new republic was going to require a different responsibility from its citizens. Carol Berkin writes that unlike monarchies, republics depended upon the rectitude and the patriotism of their collective sovereign, the citizens. Republics required a constant renewal of devotion and self-sacrifice in order to survive. They required informed citizens able to resist the siren call of the tyrant and the temptations of corruption. Thus, patriotism had to be instilled in each succeeding generation if the representative government was to endure. To whom should this vital task of raising patriots be entrusted? It was the Republican mother who would inscribe patriotism upon what Enlightenment philosophers called the blank slate, or the tabula rasa of childhood. So therefore, women were going to be responsible for playing an important role in this new government to raise a patriotic generation that they were going to have to constantly be instilling from generation to generation. In the era of the New Republic, we also see an important economic shift take place with the Industrial Revolution. As the country began to industrialize, work took men away from the home and into the office and the factory, and women were left to become the managers of the middle-class home. And that this also had a deep impact on women's theory of personality, that while men were out in the work world, women remained in the home. And historian Barbara Welter famously writes about this idea of true womanhood, that, quote, America depended upon her mothers to raise up a whole generation of Christian statesmen who could say, all I am, I owe to my angel mother. The mothers must do the inculcating of virtue, since the fathers, alas, were too busy chasing the dollar. So what I'm trying to say here is that the idea of a separate male and female sphere of influence emerges in the midst of this economic shift, that the family is impacted by the changes in the economy. And while the man is out of the home, making money and being involved in politics in the public world, the woman is the manager of the children in the private world. And we see that women also become viewed as more naturally nurturing, moral, maternal, pure. The wife is viewed as the better half of the couple. He's out being aggressive in the business world, and she is expected to be the better half, the moral half, the good half. And so women and men accept these new views of their roles and of their personalities. And so what we see is these twin ideas of Republican motherhood and true womanhood become entwined in and instilled in female personality. Women begin to integrate these ideas into their work in domesticity and politics. And I have on the slide here women's weapons. So what becomes women's weapons is developed by Joan Hedrick in her book on the biography of Harriet Beecher Stowe, that women begin to use their patriotism and their moral high ground to change people's minds about immorality in society. So we know that early on in the 1800s, an abolitionist movement emerges and women become very important members and leaders of this movement in terms of their ability to impact people's public opinion and change people's hearts on the issue of slavery. The abolitionists on the slide, Angelina and Sarah Grimke, were Southerners who grew up in a slave family and begin to actively speak and write and criticize slavery and really expose its cruelty, and in very bold terms for the time, describe the poor treatment and torture and sexual immorality that slaves had to deal with. And they begin to say, we must help our sisters. We have a sense of sisterhood, a sense of shared female experience. Harriet Beecher Stowe, in writing Uncle Tom's Cabin, explains and describes in vivid detail the cruelty of child separation when children are ripped away from their parents and sold away in to other slave owners. So that women in the abolitionist movement use their women's weapons to touch people's hearts, their weapons of morality and patriotism. And this continues into the 19th century, into the progressive era, with women like Frances Willard, who was the president of the Women's Christian Temperance Union, who called her plan for eliminating alcohol in the home protection, that drinking was a danger to the family. It caused poverty and domestic violence and child abuse, and that drinking was a danger to the family. And so as a woman who was the better half, who is the moral heart, that it was the duty of the women to change people's minds and convince society to give up alcohol. Mary Church Terrell also, as a leader of the Black women's clubs, wrote very passionately about working with Black families to help Black families to improve family conditions of sanitation and education and opening kindergartens, and understood that by helping each home that they could also impact their political opportunities. That her motto was lifting as we climb, that we are going to help each family, and then we will also all climb into better political circumstances that we're facing Black families with a racist country. So we see that there are all these examples where women have become politically engaged and publicly engaged through this acceptance of this idea of Republican motherhood and true womanhood. And so let's kind of start to bring this historical context into the present with the presidency of Donald Trump. And so when we think about President Trump's resume, it's really not compatible with Republican motherhood or true womanhood. The personal resume of the president, as with his tabloid-worthy divorces, 3 wives, bankruptcies, his defrauding of charities, his business life and his professional life is certainly not a model of moral virtue. And after his election, the promises of his administration also alarmed women and threatened the morality of the country. The policies of the anti-immigration rhetoric and the anti-Muslim policies and his policies on climate change and environmentalism, the promise to repeal Obamacare and take away healthcare, were all alarming in respect to equality and people's rights and family values. And so it really was going to fall to women in the country to protect the democracy. So women were animated to resist the Trump administration by these historical examples of Republican motherhood and true womanhood. And that we can see in the protests, at the signs, speeches women have made since the 2016 election, that the language that they use reflects these virtues and these ideas of Republican motherhood and true womanhood. So it's clear that women still had a role to play as the guardians of the Republic and of the family, that they were going to continue to be both patriotic and maternal. So the largest demonstration in American history was the day after President Trump's inauguration. The Women's March of 2017 was a very interesting event for looking at the ideas of Republican motherhood and true womanhood. The signs at the march were varied. They did not follow a consistent one message approach. And Dana Fisher has written a book called American Resistance from the Women's March to the Blue Wave. And Dana Fisher's focus in her book was the demographic information that she gathered through surveys at the women's marches. And what she found when she surveyed the marchers was that they were interested in all different things: immigrants' rights, LGBT rights, climate change, women's issues, reproductive rights. And so what she concludes when she examines her surveys was that the women at the march were really responding to the moral shock of the Trump administration, of what the danger that they presented to the Republic and to morality. In November of 2018, there were midterm elections. And in these midterm elections, there was a blue wave that swept more women than ever into national office. And Haley Stevens won a seat in Michigan, in Michigan's 11th district. And when she won on election night, she made a speech where she said, quote, "I am the daughter of a fabulous mother, and make no mistake about it, we are the defenders of our democracy." So on election night, Haley Stevens is, whether she realized it or not, connecting her victory for Congress to her mother and to Republican motherhood, that women would be the protectors of the democracy. The Center for American Women in Politics at Rutgers University also studied why women ran for office in 2018, and they concluded that, quote, "a commitment to service and advocacy, desire to promote democratic values, and devotion to finding solutions in a particularly contentious political time." That women wanted to serve. They wanted to serve their communities. They wanted to protect their communities and promote democracy. So they are also connecting their message to Republican motherhood and true womanhood. A new caucus was formed after the 2018 midterm elections, also called Moms in the House. And then this caucus was formed to support women in Congress who were mothers and had children, to accommodate them, to help support each other as moms in the House. In August of 2020, there were protests in Portland, Oregon. And the New York Times covered these protests And these women dressed in yellow with linked arms, and their signs said, "Feds stand clear, moms are here, leave our kids alone." So one of the women interviewed by the New York Times, Allison Hyder, remarked in the paper, quote, "The people of the US need to know that moms, grandmoms, and nurses are out here in the middle of the night demanding rights for everybody." So that we see that throughout the last 4 years, that women have consistently participated in a resistance to what they viewed as the threats of the Trump administration, and that it doesn't seem to have dissipated at all, that there is constantly a new blast of energy into these movements. Vice President candidate Kamala Harris calls herself Mamala, right? So still this connection to maternal vigilance and what women can do to protect the family, protect the democracy. And so after we discuss this idea of the woman's resistance, it has also provided an opportunity for reconciliation. And what I mean by that is that the women's movement has long had a long-standing problems within it. And these internal problems have been about recognizing the contributions of Black women to the Democratic Party and to the women's movement over the last 50 years. And so one of the things that has also transpired since 2016 is a long needed recognition of the importance of Black women to the Democratic Party. And Brittany Cooper, who was professor at Rutgers University, was quoted in NBC News saying that where we're going with the women's movement is more inclusive. So that this was an opportunity for the women's movement to look at itself and to atone for some of the problems of the past. And she writes, quote, "It's giving intersectional feminism a mainstream platform like this and saying it's not a white women's issue and women of color issues as an addendum. It means we're going to lead with and we include everybody." So that the future of the women's movement has been an opportunity to build a better and more inclusive women's movement going forward. And finally, another thing that has transpired since 2016 has been the ratification of the ERA, the Equal Rights Amendment, by the 3 remaining states. That the ERA was a moribund issue, that it had expired in 1982. And in 2017, Nevada ratified the ERA, the first state to do so in 30 years. And then Illinois in 2018, and then in January of 2020, Virginia became the 38th state. So one of the other things that seems to have also increased the female engagement politically since 2016 is a renewed interest in the ratification of the Equal Rights Amendment. And so Alaska's Republican Senator Lisa Murkowski spoke on June 4th in front of the Senate saying that women's equality is fundamental to an American way of life, and it is far past time that it is expressly recognized in the Constitution. So she is saying, and she made this speech on the 100th anniversary of suffrage. She was making a speech and she connected it to the ERA. So we are seeing that this is possibly going to be a new, something new that is going to also result from the increased female engagement in politics. And so finally, last week, President Trump made a speech at a rally, and he seems to recognize this problem with women. And he says, "Suburban women, will you please like me?" So he recognizes that he needs to plead for women's support, because throughout his presidency, we've seen a consistent resistance and a rise in women's political engagement by running for office, and also a revitalized, more inclusive women's movement that may ultimately lead to the ratification of the 28th Amendment. Thank you so much.
So that was a wonderful presentation, Professor Semeka, and my presentation is going to be a deep dive into the activism of these newly progressive, politically motivated women, and in this case, it's going to cover women in a conservative locale, the suburbs of Georgia, and their influence over the last 4 years. One difference, though, between what I'm going to share with you in a minute and what Dr. Symeka presented is I'm embedded with the activists. I have been going to their meetings, I've been going to their rallies, I've been interviewing the activists, and I'm not quite at the point where I'm ready to draw some conclusions about where they fit in with American history and the women's movement historically. I'm still in that discovery phase, and I'm hoping to leave a record behind for future historians to look back and understand this women's movement and to see where it takes us. So give me a second while I bring up my images that I've prepared. So my story, of course, overlaps with Dr. Symeka's because it begins with the Women's March of 2017, and I attended the march here in Atlanta. I traveled downtown from a suburb north of the city, and I took the MARTA, which is our public transportation. And I can tell you, I was absolutely floored that when I got to the station, there were, I don't know, hundreds of women waiting to get on the train. They had parked their cars from even further north to take the train downtown. And I should share, all of these photos are mine. And so I stamped that quick image you're seeing on the left of the older woman with the teenage girl. And it was just an array of humanity of all ages. And we were told that morning that the turnout was supposed to be in the area of around 10,000. And you could tell very quickly when you got downtown to the Civil and Human Rights Center that it was far more people than that. And it was particularly stunning because it was not a good weather day. It was rainy and it was cold. Eventually, the rain let up. So anyway, I came home that day, and if you were a participant in the women's marches and you turned into the news that night, you know that one of the big stories was President Trump claiming that his turnout at his inauguration was larger than it was, but the opposite had happened with the women's marches. The turnout was larger than anyone expected. And I heard that on our local news that 60,000 participants showed up in Atlanta. And I knew immediately, I only lived in Atlanta for maybe 20 something years, but I knew I had never seen anything like that. And I consulted that, that excellent historical research site. I got on Google and I typed in something like protest marches in Atlanta. And I found out that the attendance at this 2017 march exceeded the previous largest protest in Atlanta history, and that was the 1968 funeral procession for Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. So I knew this was something big. The question is, where was it going to go from here? Okay. And so what happened in the days and weeks to come was that I noticed as someone who had participated in the Women's March and had been kind of clued in through Facebook, because that's how women were recruited to go to one of these marches, that all of these new groups were springing up in the metro area, again, in places like Cobb County or Gwinnett County, which had previously been, Republican strongholds. But of course, in 2016, they had turned and voted for Clinton. So we already knew something was going on there, but there were all these women's groups emerging. And the largest of these groups, or what became the largest of these groups and the most active of these groups, was one called Pave It Blue. And this is going to strike you as reinforcing, again, what Professor Semeka has just said about the women that she has studied. So the women in Pave It Blue were concerned about an array of progressive issues. You're seeing here their mission statement here. They were concerned about the rights of women. They were concerned about racial profiling and policing. They were concerned about anti-immigrant sentiments, and they were concerned about attacks on the gay population. And yet, when it came right down to what it is that they thought we're going to actually do moving forward, they decided, you know what? None of the issues that we care about are going to be taken care of unless we elect more Democrats, progressives, and hopefully more women, not just at the federal level, but particularly at the local level. And in 2017, when we started the new year in 2017, the Republican Party not only held the governor's seat, but they also had a supermajority in the legislature. So there was a real impetus to move things ahead. And it kind of was fortunate for Pave It Blue that they could immediately become involved in an actual election. Because if you recall, the first federal election after the presidential one was the 6th district congressional special election, and that was an open seat. The conservative Republican who held that seat was going to become President Trump's Health and Human Services Secretary. So there was this open seat, and there was this young, 30-something unknown guy, a documentary filmmaker who grew up in the suburbs of Georgia, who had some experience working on the Hill for John Lewis. His name was John Ossoff, and he decided to run. Well, the women of Pave It Blue and some of these other groups decided to get behind Ossoff, and that was great for him. But since he ultimately lost that first election, it was probably actually better for the women, because his election was their education in retail politics. So Rachel Berhnard, who talked about the texting, the women learned to do this texting for votes. They learned to canvass. They learned to use the phone apps for how to target voters. And then they went way beyond the things that ordinary volunteers did. So the women of Pave It Blue, so if you look at this picture in the top left-hand corner that I took of the school bus, the women of Pave It Blue, and they were pretty affluent. They actually rented a yellow school bus, painted it red, white, and blue, and gave it, you can't see the side of the bus, but it had all of the slogans and lingo to elect John Ossoff. And what they would do is they would ride around to parks, and they would hold rallies. Some of them dressed up as dinosaurs for democracy. Some of them, like this woman you're seeing down here, I've actually interviewed her for my research, started knitting sweaters. Some of them made buttons, and they just went, what can we say? As they used to say, we worked our Ossoffs off for John. All right. And so this was their education in retail politics. So as this movement went on, the work on behalf of John Ossoff continued. And I started actually interviewing some of the leaders of this group and the other groups. I started thinking, well, what is this? Is this a new feminist movement? Or is it, as Dr. Symeka raised, is it part of earlier traditions, right? She harkened back to the 19th century. Personally, I think there may be more connections with the progressive movement of the early 20th century. But you know what? I was in the thick of it, and my goal at the beginning of my research was to interview as many women as I could about their motivations for getting involved in politics, for changing their lives in doing so, and to see where it took them. And in particular, I ended up focusing on the women who had the greatest involvement. And those are the ones who decided to put themselves out there and actually run for office. And there were a lot of them in 2018. So what I found was they weren't disillusioned by the experience of working for John Ossoff. If anything, he had lost by not a large margin. They were very much energized, and it just built going into the midterms in 2018. And what we saw in 2018 here in Georgia was that more women ran for state and federal offices here than in any other state in the country. Okay, so I knew again that something very significant was going on, particularly in the Atlanta suburbs, where so much of the energy was there among women. And let me just share that even more are on the ballot today. I don't have a full count, but I know that the organization that produced the poster you're seeing on the left, that is Georgia Win List. They are like a local Georgia version of Emily's List. They endorsed 36 candidates in 2018, and they have now endorsed 54 candidates, female candidates, going into the 2020 elections. But there were some huge successes in 2018 as a result of progressive women's activism. And the greatest success was back in that 6th district. So while John Ossoff didn't prevail in 2017 in the special election, Lucy McBath, who, to echo Dr. Symeka's presentation, she worked for her son actually was a victim of gun violence. He was killed, and she was a prominent spokesperson for Moms Against Gun Violence, and she won that congressional seat. And then the woman pictured below her, Carolyn Bordeaux, who is actually a political science professor at Georgia State, she came within 500 votes of winning the 7th district congressional seat, and she is favored to win that seat moving into 2020. And who is pictured next to her, who played a big role in her campaign in 2020, is Jen Cox, one of the subjects of my research, who was one of the founders of Pave It Blue. And we also had in 2018, as everyone knows, both a woman running for governor, Stacey Abrams, and we also had a woman running for a lieutenant governor, and she was Sarah Riggs Amico, and she was a CEO of she is a CEO of a trucking company. So Abrams only lost by 50,000 votes, which has really propelled women to keep at it, moving into 2020, thinking that this may be the election where women can change Georgia from a red state into the blue column. But let me just go back a little bit to, again, situate the progress that has gone on in Georgia with women's activism by sharing some data with you. And here we go. This is the number of women in the Georgia legislature. So in 2000, and I should say Georgia has had the lowest, some of the lowest rates of women's representation in the state house. And in 2000, fewer than 1 in 5 women in the legislature, fewer than 1 in 5 representatives in Georgia were female. And let me share that 2000, the Democratic Party was in a terrible state in Georgia. It was in complete disarray. It pretty much had folded its tent. And that explains a lot of, it wasn't just that women weren't being elected, Democrats were doing terribly. 2018, we see 23% of seats held by women. And then there's a big jump to after the midterms, where 1/3 of the legislators are female now. And that's a record for the state. And we're looking at estimates that we could get maybe closer even to parity in 2020. Let me backtrack once more, going back into the 19th century, again, to stress how momentous some of these changes are in the 21st century. So Georgia has a history as far as women and politics of being one of the United States' most patriarchal. Women were very strongly opposed in Georgia to the 19th Amendment and were instrumental in making sure that the Georgia legislature did not ratify the suffrage amendment. And the picture you're seeing there is of Mrs. Millie Rutherford. She was not a Confederate wife. Rather, she donned a hoop skirt in order to lobby the Georgia legislature in 1915 to make sure that they did not support the women's vote. Her attitude was that if women got mixed up in dirty politics, their morality would be compromised. And so it was better for them to have an influence from outside of politics, which she surely did as one of the leaders of the Daughters of the American Confederacy. And then moving ahead at the end of the 20th century, Georgia was one of the states that made sure that the Equal Rights Amendment would not be passed. And Georgia is not one of the states, as Dr. Semeka mentioned, it's not one of the states that has ratified the ERA recently. However, there was the amendment was introduced in the Georgia legislature. At the end of my presentation, I will mention that as one of the changes that happened as a result of increased women's representation. And so again, what we're seeing going on in Georgia right now in the 21st century is truly historic, given the state's past as being pretty much hostile to women's full participation in the political life of the state. Now, all of the participation by women and also a diverse group of women, so women who are African American, who are Latino, who are South Asian Muslims, who are both Christian and also Jewish. A lot of that is conditioned by the demographic change that the state and particularly the metropolitan areas have experienced in Georgia in the 21st century. So really that is the backdrop. And let me just share that the women that I've interviewed who have run for office in Georgia, many of them, yes, some of them grew up in Georgia, but I would say the majority of them either were educated outside the state or left the state to pursue their careers, and then later in life, maybe in their 30s, came back to raise families or to pursue their careers. So there are very different backgrounds of previous generations of women who were involved in politics. So they have a much broader multicultural and even international perspective on the need to get involved in political activities. All right, so let me get back to sharing with you some of the stories of the subjects of my research and the things that motivated them to really upend the way they live their lives to become, so active in especially running for office, which is so time consuming. It doesn't matter whether you're a man or a woman. It's just going to occupy all of your waking moments other than the time, whatever time you've put aside, to deal with your family and to put in your day job. So let me just share, the woman on the left you're seeing is Zara Karenchak. And Zara Karenchak had a distinguished career as a federal prosecutor, and she had founded her own law practice. And Zara was one of the first women in America to attend the U.S. Air Force Academy. She did grow up in Georgia, but she attended the academy in Colorado. And then she became an Air Force officer. She was actually an intelligence officer stationed in the Middle East during the First Persian Gulf War. And Zara, like all of these women that I interviewed, of course, she was very disappointed that Mrs. Clinton didn't win in 2016. And she was very discouraged that a man like Donald Trump was elected president. On election night, it was her daughters who actually put the bug in her ear that maybe mom should run for office, given the coarse rhetoric that Donald Trump used in the campaign towards women. They said, Mom, you get along with people. You're a great speaker. You're fierce. Why don't you do it? And she really did start to mull it around then. And then she thought about also her role as a veteran. And certainly Georgia has a very large percentage of veterans. And she told me that she was really, really bothered by the way Trump denigrated veterans, and as we've seen, that has only that picked up over the 4 years of his administration, and that's what prompted her to run for a what had been considered a solidly Republican state Senate seat. And she did win that seat, and you're seeing her there. She got some help along the way, canvassing, partnered up with Lucy McBath, who won that congressional district, and another newcomer to politics, Angelica Kaushka, a professor who is also one of my research subjects, who won a House seat, also in Gwinnett County. And then the woman you're seeing on the right with her arm lifted in the air, and the reason she's so fierce looking in this photograph is she is speaking out against an anti-abortion bill, which came up in her first term in the Georgia legislature. What prompted Jen Jordan to run for office in 2018 was that she had recently represented a rape victim. This was a teenage girl who had been assaulted by her dental assistant in his office, and this dental assistant had actually filmed the assault on his cell phone, and he was doing time in jail. And Jen was suing the dental practice for negligence and trying to get some monetary compensation for the girl and her family. And you know what? She won her case. She won $3.2 million in a jury trial. But then the dental office appealed the verdict. And when Jen went to argue on appeal the case before the Georgia Supreme Court, she told me that she went before the panel of judges, all of whom were white and men, and her heart sank, and she knew they simply weren't going to understand what happened to this girl, and they overturned the verdict, claiming that the dental practice could not have been responsible for what their employee did. And she said, really, that leaving the courtroom that day solidified things for her, and that's when she went on to run, and eventually she did win her state Senate seat. So other women that I've interviewed, they were prompted to run for office, and it was a blend, being both women, but also their unique ethnic and racial backgrounds prompted them to put aside many things they enjoy doing, like gardening or vacation with family, or simple things like watching movies, exercising, all of the things women do besides work their day jobs. And that's what prompted them. And so the woman on the left, Jasmine Clark, she is a nursing professor. She teaches at Emory Nursing School, and very disturbed by both Trump's attitudes and policies towards African Americans, and of course the rhetoric, but also for her as a scientist, she was very discouraged with what she saw the clock being turned about on using facts and evidence on policymaking, global climate change, and women's reproductive rights. And she organized the first ever March on Science in Atlanta in 2018. And actually the success she had with getting 10 to 20,000 people to show up for that march led her to believe she could mobilize supporters for a run for State House. And then the woman on the bottom, you're seeing there, that's Shelley Hutchinson. She's actually a native of New Orleans who moved to Georgia to teach at University of Georgia in the social work school. She owns 3 counseling clinics, and also, like Jasmine, very much bothered by the rhetoric and attitudes towards African Americans. But her concern was also about the opiate crisis and the lack of funding and commitment to mental health in Georgia. That prompted her to run for a state house seat, which she won. And then the woman on the right, Ayesha Yacoub, she was right out of public policy school at the University of Georgia. She's actually a graduate of both University of Georgia undergrad and graduate school. She calls herself a double dog. She is the child of Pakistani immigrants, but she was born and raised in Georgia. And she made a kind of a long shot bid for a state house seat also in Gwinnett County. The reason I say long shot is because her district was very heavily voted for Trump in 2016, but nevertheless, she decided to make an attempt. Actually, she was only 24 when she ran for office, so she kind of took the long game thinking, you know what, I'm going to get my name out there. But what was it that motivated her? Well, if you recall, when I think it was 1 week after the inauguration, the first thing that President Trump announced was a ban on immigration from Muslim countries. And Aisha was one of the people who organized a protest down at the airport, the Atlanta airport. She also was one of the organizers of the Women's March. And so her concern for immigrant rights and civil rights was what propelled her. And she's still active. Actually, she's active right now in registering Asian American voters. Now, looking back at my research, looking back at my subjects and the kinds of things they've gotten involved in, I asked the question, did women make a difference in the Georgia State House? Will they make a difference in 2020? And so far, what I've concluded, even in just that short period of time of a couple of years of activism, we saw that women did make a difference. So the increased representation of women in the State House led them to take on issues that were never heard before on the floor of the Georgia Capitol. What am I talking about? They openly complained about being assigned by male legislatures to crappy committees, ones that had no power in the Georgia legislature. They also complained about a proposed, and this was sort of an in-house thing, a proposed rule that would have limited the punishments meted out for legislators who were involved in sexual harassment. Well, they got that one turned around. And also they introduced an amendment that would ratify the equal rights in Georgia. I think that the most dramatic thing they did was putting up a fierce fight against what was called the Heartbeat Bill, which was a law that was that proposed to ban abortions from the time a woman found out she was pregnant at 6 weeks. That law actually passed. But let me just share that in 2020, a federal judge in Atlanta agreed with every argument the women legislators made about this law being incompatible with the trimester system that was laid out in Roe versus Wade, and now there's an injunction on that law. So yes, they have made a difference in the short time they have been in the legislature. And then moving ahead to the election, which we are approaching in, 12 days. You're hearing about record turnout in Georgia, lines on the first day of in-person voting, record numbers of absentee ballots. I am certain that there never would have been this degree of voter engagement if not for the work of women activists like Stacey Abrams, who lost her race for governor in 2018, but created an organization called Fair Fight, which is a massive get out the vote operation all over the country, but really, really focused on Georgia, especially because she wants to run again in 2022. A new organization sprang up called the Georgia Postcard Project, And the woman who heads up, a suburban woman, Atlanta suburban woman who heads up that project, got women in Georgia and all over the country to handwrite messages to Democratic leaning or Democratic voters, reminding them to get an absentee ballot and vote. And she mailed out over 260,000 postcards. A story on her project has been on both local and national news. And then because of this activism, there is a prediction that maybe the Georgia State House can actually flip from red to blue. And also, if it does flip, so many of those new legislatures, by virtue of who is running this session, of course, they will be women. So I'll leave you with that. I look forward to hearing any questions you have about what I have seen and observed. And thank you so much.
All right, I noticed. Thank you very much, ladies. I appreciated all of your presentations. I personally have lots of questions for all of you, but we've already getting questions from the audience, so I would prefer to let them ask their questions first. So I don't know if Mabin's going to post the questions below so we can see them, but there's a question from Melissa. Yeah, lots of politically active conservative women who actively support Trump, and how might their politics look? And this really is a question I had, because a lot of conservative women do embrace things like Republican motherhood and true womanhood. So these similar concepts that are being talked about. So if anyone would care to discuss that.
Yeah, actually, I was asked that in a presentation this week at my college. And you know what? I mean, I'm here in Georgia. I'm living it. There are suburban women who are active somewhat, but they really aren't. It's not like the progressive women. They're not out there. They're just not. Yeah, there may be women. There are going to be women voting for Trump, but they're not the ones waving the signs. There's no Republican postcard project. There's no equivalent to any. All of the energy is on the progressive side. Do you agree with that, Jane?
Yeah, I would definitely say that. And I would also say that I think that a lot of middle of the road Republican women are extremely uncomfortable with the Trump agenda. And like women, even like Martha McSally, who is probably going to lose her seat in the Senate, and other women who have been sort of in exile. And I talk about this a little in my paper, that they end up in, some Republican women have kind of wound up in political purgatory, because they're kind of on the fringe of their party now, because they won't toe the line, and they can't speak out honestly in favor of the child separation policy and some of these things that are really abhorrent to them. Women like Lisa Murkowski, who is a moderate Republican in Alaska, that the Trump agenda has really pigeonholed a lot of these women. And I'm actually really interested as a teacher in talking about the history of conservatism in women, because I think that and this actually speaks to your paper, Bianca, a little bit with Jean Kirkpatrick, is that women that I study in True Womanhood, and these are conservative women. These are church women. These are women with with strong conservative values. That should be a natural fit for the Republican Party. But we see in this environment, they've really been marginalized, I think, and their voices are not really front and center.
All right, I saw that there's a question to Ellen. Thanks for sharing your presentation on Pave It Blue, Georgia. Pave It Blue's leadership are white suburban women. Has Pave It Blue been able to expand their membership?
So Pave It Blue is white. It's not white. Let me just share. It's not only white women in Pave It Blue. The leaders are white. And let me just share, I'm right in the middle of it. And I've interviewed women of all races and ethnicities. There have been conflicts over racial issues. There have been, again, I'm in the middle of it, and I can't draw any conclusions about it. But if you look, the candidates that are running are, I would say the majority. I wouldn't say the majority, but at least half of them are African American, and they have gotten the full support of these white suburban women. Look, Lucy McBath, her candidacy was propelled by them. They went all out for her. So in that sense, it's very collaborative. It's extremely the activism, and that might be historic right there, particularly in a state like Georgia. And where white women have Black Lives Matter signs up and are actually doing the work they need to elect Black women. So most of the groups, because of where they're located, where the energy is is the suburbs of Atlanta, which are more white than other suburbs south of the city. Yeah, the majority and the leaders are white women, but I would say they're diverse, and the white women are work very closely with Black women in the organization. So maybe if the leaders are white, then like the secretary or some of the facilitators, like on the Facebook page, the moderators. I know Pave It Blue had a Black woman moderator. So again, that's a whole other thing I'm really looking forward to getting at, but I'm in the middle of it. Maybe Jane, you have some thoughts on that.
I really think a reconciliation is happening right now in real time. And I think we see it in terms of party leadership. We're seeing it in terms of fundraising. We're seeing that every time we see the recognition of women of color in the Democratic Party and they're being put forward as a leader, we see just more energy being released. And so I think that it is definitely the time has been ripe for this. And I think that no one's going backward. This is just going to be, I think, more progress going forward.
I think that relates to another question that was about the Pave It Blue to Ellen, which from Lauren McIver Thompson said that as a fellow Georgia Pave It Blue person, can you talk about controversies in a group and issues with race, which we kind of just did, but if there's anything that you wanted to add to that.
A lot of the controversies that I've witnessed, and again, I haven't got into the deep parts of it. I'm kind of waiting till after the 2020 election to get back to it, because it's really hard to even talk to people right now. But just like Lauren probably knows from reading the Facebook page, a lot of those controversies had more to do with joisting through social media, honestly. Like, I don't know how to describe it. Stupid crap. People being saying things that rub people the wrong way, that they probably didn't intend, and then being offensive when in ways that they shouldn't be to other people. But when you get right down to the actual activism on the ground, the rallies and the postcard writing and the donations of money, I don't see it. And maybe I'm blind to it, or I'm not objective enough. And I've interviewed a lot of Black political candidates, and maybe I need to have a Black colleague interview them and ask them. Maybe they don't want to tell. I'm just throwing that out. Maybe they don't want to tell me how things that have been difficult or challenging to me. They haven't. So that leads me, I definitely am going to work at that, because yes, there have been tensions, but if you look at the results, they've actually leaned towards Jane Symeka's observation about this kind of historic reconciliation, more than divisiveness and rancor. Yeah.
Thank you. Now, Rachel, I had a question for you. When I was reading your paper, there's a lot of interesting stuff in there. Women have the most offensive, discouraging, and silencing messages compared to other groups, as you said, but you also noted that they got higher response rates than males, or generic names, and they got a lot higher voter commitments to call their representatives. So they're being silenced and discouraged, they're still getting more results. So why is that, do you think?
It's a great question, Bianca, and my co-author and I have puzzled a little bit over this, how to think about it. On the one hand, in terms of the responses they get, as you note, there's just more variation, period. So on the one hand, they're getting some real positive results in terms of generating those commitments to attend rallies, to call their legislators. On the other, they're also getting the sort of worst of the worst in terms of these really offensive and discouraging messages. So part of that could be what we have sort of puzzled over is maybe people just feel more comfortable expressing this wide range of emotions and actions with women, that potentially, like, one alternative story is that people feel kind of nervous to tell off a guy, for instance. So if they think that it is Michael texting them, I mean, not that they necessarily have any personal information, but that you might be afraid, gosh, what if he lashes out or he sends me more threatening messages? I mean, it's coming into you on your phone, right? So maybe people are more afraid that a man will do that than a woman. And so that could be part of it. And we're not really sure what to make of the higher response rates either, because it's the same sort of problem. I mean, the idea that people are kind of taking the extra time to write women a nasty message seems super depressing, but it could also be that they're taking the time to write, these sort of positive commitments to call and everything as well. So we can't sort of separate out exactly what those motivations are, but it's pretty distinct. And if you will, the bad treatment of volunteers who are assigned the female name is pretty distinct from the sort of bad treatment that our no name condition gets. So, in that condition, there is also a lot of silencing and discouragement and everything, but the conversations are cut off very quickly. So people just assume it's a bot or an automated message or something like that, and they just say, stop, no, whatever. And the content of the messages is really different for women. I mean, you saw some of them, even the ones that are not marked as offensive, might be something like "lose my number, lady," which is a very different way of saying I'd like to stop the conversation than "please stop texting," right? So I think there's a lot more to explore here that we're just getting into. We have some challenges to navigate in terms of how short the messages are as well. So a lot of the ways that we would normally do kind of textual analysis are really hard to bring to bear when you have, these tiny snippets. So we're thinking about that and thinking about follow-up studies we might need to design to get at that more. But thank you. It's a great question. And we welcome, if anyone in the audience has some thoughts about what's going on there, we welcome
Rachel, let me just share that I, as part of my research, but also my own participation, I did a lot of canvassing and all that stuff with women. And you know what? I think the women who go out and volunteer, like when we canvassed in 2018, doors shut in our face, and men, a lot of rude men, but also when you're a woman, you get invited in the house. I know that's hard to imagine in this climate. So I see how it could cut both ways. I mean, we would get invited into people's living rooms, sit down, need a cup of coffee. Oh, it's so hot out there. How about an ice cold glass of water? And then there were some men would not let their wives come to the door, and we wondered, are we creating a domestic abuse situation where maybe now that they know the wife is a Democrat? So this seems I think I'm totally fascinated, but I think the women kind of feel like they're at battle. The volunteers feel like this is war. And if we get people saying crappy things at us or sexist things, then we just want to fight harder, kind of like men in battle. It's like almost like we got our stripes doing this, and they like that. They like having war stories that they can share. So just something interesting.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I do see that in some of my other work, which has been with women's candidate training organizations, that the women who are most likely to run for office are actually the ones who report the highest number of experiences of previous discrimination, barriers to running, et cetera. And we think it is that sort of warrior, we describe it as like the warrior woman motivation, that I'm going in because I care about these things, because I'm motivated by these past experiences rather than being discouraged by them, which I think was, there was a sort of shrinking violet idea that women will be turned away because they don't like the conflict or they're afraid of the competition or something. And, it's hard to know how much of that is just a different moment in time, right? The environment is very different in the 21st century than in some of the earlier periods.
Okay, I just thought of one more anecdote that our listeners might want to hear about this warrior thing. So some of the women in Pave It Blue, they got really discouraged that the signs for John Ossoff were being torn down and vandalized. So they dressed up in black from head to toe, like in spandex. And they went out at night with John Ossoff signs and they coated them with Vaseline and glitter. And yeah, really. And they re-put them out all over the city. They put the signs in the back of their minivans and they drove out and they called themselves sign ninjas, like little like teenagers. But they love that. They love putting on Facebook their pictures of them like all fierce, And so that's the kind of, I think that goes back to that warrior thing you're talking about. It just made it more fun and interesting and something they could, again, from my research, a lot of this is, the reason they like it is they built community. And that's why I think this is a lasting movement.
Yeah, I read a lot about this, like Rachel's, your material and your paper. I read a lot about this for my paper because I have a whole section of my paper on women running for office, and I didn't get to really delve into it in terms of the time constraint, but the material that I read and the background that I read on this and the women that I know who have gone through candidate training talk a lot about overcoming this issue of silence and the personal barriers people feel about being attacked online, being attacked on social media, trolls, and it's a real thing, and it's really interesting. But it reminded me, and just what you guys were both referring to in terms of a sense of sisterhood and the determination that builds in people when they feel like they are being treated badly, is really reminds me of the suffrage movement and women like Alice Paul, that, the more they put her in jail, the more determined she became to never give up. And it's one of the things I think we learn from these kinds of movements is that repressing people who feel like they have the moral high ground and are fighting for something that's right, they're only going to become more determined. They're not going to give up.
Determined was the first word that I used after reading all three of your papers when I was just thinking of just random thoughts. I was just amazed at how determined women were. And it made me feel kind of bad about myself because I have not been so politically active or as brave as other women have been, but it was very inspirational. I enjoyed it quite a bit. We have about a minute left. I don't know if that's time to answer another question, or do you guys have questions for each other? Any comment?
I really loved listening to all the presentations, and they all really overlapped so nicely. Mm-hmm. And I would love to talk to you more about all the things that we are all finding in our research on women in politics.
Agreed. Well, hopefully we can start an email thing, share information and stuff together. All right, well, thank you guys very much for sharing your papers and your research with us. Fascinating stuff, very timely stuff, very interesting. So I guess now we're taking a break for 15 minutes and then we'll reconvene for our keynote speaker. So thank you very much.
Thank you.